After today's class, a fourth of the course will be over. It's alarming, and it shows how inappropriate this format is to the exploration of alternatives. We would require indefinite time. And then the problem would be not just the practical arrangements of the university, but the tax on your patience. And I'm afraid I would be left like the conductor in one of Haydn's symphonies, in which everyone leaves little by little. But we will persist. I have rearranged the plan in the following way. And the plan originally laid out in the syllabus, there'd be a very brief discussion of the alternatives in the American context, and then in the European setting, European social democracy. And then several weeks for the exploration of the main axes of a progressive alternative: democratizing the market, equipping the individual, deepening democracy, and then the alternative forms of globalization. Now, you will have noticed that to some extent I am anticipating the substantive programmatic discussion in this American conversation. And that means that later I will have to compress the second part of the course about those main axes, and deal with it as the generalization and deepening of the ideas explored now, but so be it. So let me return to the American discussion. And I remind you of what we have done up to now. I began by describing the message of the American prophets and criticizing this message with respect to two taints on it: the inadequate view of the relation between self-construction and solidarity, and the acceptance of an institutional idolatry, the exemption of the institutional arrangements of the country from the experimentalist impulse that is otherwise so alive in American culture. And then I sought inspiration in the discussion of episodes of reconstruction of the country in American history. The early 19th century, the progressive traditions of the late 19th century and early 21st century, and the New Deal. And then last week, the discussion of the large elements of a progressive alternative in the American setting. And there were three elements on which I focused in political economy: the relation of the backward to the advanced parts of the production system, the relation of labor to capital, and the relation of finance to the real economy, to the productive agenda of society. Now I want to add a fourth element to this discussion of political economy. And the fourth element has to do with the financing of the American state. So the basic thesis is there is no progressive alternative that is compatible with the present level of the financing of the state in the United States. The aggregate tax take in the United States is around 30% of GDP, at least 10% lower than the equivalent in Europe. And on that basis, no sustained progressive alternative is feasible. So the question is how we should think about the financing of the state and about taxation, which is, after all, one of the main subjects of political dispute. Now, this is a theme of very general interest because it has to do not only with the United States, but with the whole world, and how we approach our thinking about taxation and redistribution in general in any national context. And I want to present an argument organized around three theses. The first thesis is one with which you are already familiar. Initiatives that influence the arrangements that shape the primary distribution of income and of advantage, or more generally, of economic and educational advantage, have priority over initiatives that attempt to correct after the fact the distribution of advantage. Compensatory redistribution by progressive taxation or redistributive social spending. Now, the basis of this thesis is straightforward. If we reify the market order, the present arrangements of economic decentralization, and then simply attempt to correct after the fact the inequalities generated in the market, what we can do by way of correction will be very limited. The degree of compensatory and retrospective redistribution will have to be massive to deal adequately with the inequalities generated in the established market order. And long before the corrective redistribution reaches the threshold necessary to correct these inequalities, it will begin to derange the established economic arrangements and incentives and to exact an unacceptable cost in economic output. Now, this fact is captured in the familiar rhetorical apparatus of a tension between efficiency and equity. So the idea is that we achieve equity by correcting after the fact the inequalities generated in the market. But that we are limited in this retrospective correction by the demands of efficiency, that is to say, of output. And so all we can do, according to this way of thinking, is to attenuate after the fact the inequalities generated in the market. The market then, on this view, is a tremendous instrument for the creation of wealth. Unfortunately, it generates inequalities, and then after the fact, we correct these inequalities through progressive taxation and redistributive social spending. So the first thesis is simply that we can go much further by way of limiting inequality if we are able to innovate in the arrangements that shape the primary or fundamental distribution of advantage. rather than simply trying to correct after the fact what the market has wrought. And this idea in recent political and ideological disputes has sometimes been labeled pre-distribution. But that's the fundamental notion. Now, of course, this notion rests on a theoretical or analytical premise. The premise is that there is no single natural and necessary way of organizing a market order, and that some ways of organizing a market order are more unequalizing than others. Now then, if you ask what's the content, the institutional content of this idea of pre-distribution, the answer, or the partial answer, lies in the three issues that we have just explored last week. The relation of the backward to the advanced parts of production, the relation of labor to capital, and the relation of finance to production. So that's the first thesis. Example of the thesis. If we want to make substantial progress in the level of equality and inclusion, we cannot tolerate the present form of the knowledge economy, the insular form of the knowledge economy, which limits the knowledge economy to an exclusive fringe, excluding the vast majority of businesses and workers, and deepens the chasm between the advanced parts of the production, the advanced and the backward parts of the production system. Now comes the second thesis in the order of priority. The second thesis has to do with the way of thinking about the budget, both on the revenue-raising side and on the spending side. So even if we regard compensatory redistribution by tax and transfer as ancillary to changes in the arrangements that shape the fundamental distribution of advantage, that doesn't mean that this retrospective redistribution is insignificant. It has a place, although its place is subordinate to the innovations that shape the fundamental distribution. And how should we think then of this whole system of retrospective correction through progressive taxation and redistributive social spending, even after we've recognized its subordinate role? Now, let me begin with the description of an enigma in the comparative fiscal experience of the rich North Atlantic countries. On paper, the rich North Atlantic country that has the most progressive tax system is the United States, astonishingly, because its tax system gives a relatively prominent role to the progressive taxation of personal income. But we all know that the United States is by far the most unequal of the rich industrial democracies. On the other hand, the European social democracies, much less unequal than the United States, give a relatively more prominent role to the indirect and avowedly regressive taxation of consumption. The transactions-based taxation of consumption, especially through the comprehensive flat rate value-added tax in most European countries, or through some functional equivalent to it. For example, in France, where there's an amalgam of indirect forms of taxation of consumption that are, in the aggregate, functional equivalents of the VAT, the value-added tax. Now, how can we explain this riddle? That in the country that, on the surface, has the most progressive tax system, there's the greatest inequality. And in the countries that are relatively more equal, there's a reliance on this regressive form of taxation. This is, of course, a challenge to the orthodoxies of the progressives. And it's really strange that this topic should not be an object of more central controversy in the contemporary political disputes. It seems that on the whole, especially in the United States, the progressives have come to prefer pietistic gestures to transformative effects. They know that progressive taxation has only a marginal effect on inequality. Most of them know that. But it seems that the effect of this invocation, or the function of this invocation of progressive taxation, especially at election time, is for them to show on whose side they are. Despite the very limited practical efficacy of this instrument. So the explanation of the riddle is the following. In the short to medium term, what matters most with respect to the budget, the total system of taxation and spending with regard to inequality, is not how progressive the tax system is on the revenue-raising side. It is the aggregate level of the tax take and how it is spent. So the fundamental reason for which the European systems of taxation and social spending are in the aggregate more egalitarian or redistributive than the American system is very simple. That the European societies take in more by way of tax take, at least 10% of GDP more. And they spend that higher tax take redistributively. So that everything that is lost by way of redistributive taxation on the revenue-raising side of the budget is gained in double on the spending side. Now, what then is the relation between the regressive character of the tax system, the budget on the revenue-raising side, and the progressive or redistributive effect of the budget on the spending side? The relation is this. The comprehensive flat rate value-added tax, or the functional equivalent to it, is conceptually the most neutral possible form of taxation with respect to relative prices. A very simple way to understand it is this. Imagine the entire economy as an input-output table. What the value-added tax does is it takes a constant proportion of the transformation of every input into every output. the value added. And it is therefore, if it is truly general and makes no exceptions, the most neutral form of taxation with respect to the system of relative prices. So the result is that it makes it possible to maximize the tax take while minimizing the trauma to relative prices and therefore to established economic arrangements and incentives. So in short, the state can take in more money with less economic trauma. And what it takes in, it can then spend redistributively. That's, according to this argument that I'm making, the explanation. Yes?
Can you just clarify by what you mean trauma?
So if you distort the system of relative prices, you begin to create economic confusion and economic cost. And this is what the economists would regard as a burden, an incubus on efficiency, on allocational efficiency. And that is then manifest in some lowering of potential output. That's it. So in the value-added tax, in principle, you have a system of taxation that leaves relative prices alone, and it therefore exacts no charge on potential output in that respect. It minimizes the effect. It doesn't derange the established economic arrangements and incentives. The state can take more with less economic confusion. And as opposed to this circumstance in which for each intervention in the system of relative prices, there is an economic cost, a cost in potential output. Now, this is a very simple fact, but here it's really interesting that this fact is not the object of a general discussion. It's a little complicated. It's not very complicated, but it's somewhat complicated because it involves an element of paradox, that a form of taxation that appears on its face to be regressive is part of a system which in its overall effect is progressive. Yes?
I was just going to concretize what the value-added tax would mean. So, like, if you think about our phones, for example, at every part of the chain of production, so there's silicone, the plastic, the aluminum, the glass.
Yes.
What a value-added tax does is it's self-reinforcing. So, if you're the glass manufacturer, you're paying 10% on all the production, the value adding you're creating in the process.
Yes.
And then when you're manufacturing and you're integrating the glass with the aluminum and the silicone, then you're collecting 10%.
Yes.
You have incentive to get the 10% from the supplier in the chain below you.
Yes.
And so on and so forth throughout the chain. So as a consumer, you feel it at the point of sale when you see a 10% value-added tax.
Yes.
The sale of the iPhone. But actually what we've been able to do is that every single part of the production chain, the public gets a slice.
Exactly. At each step of the process of circulation and aggregation of value, the state takes a cut. So for the value-added tax to be truly neutral, there can be no exceptions. And every service, every good has to be subject to the same level of taxation so that the system of relative prices is left untouched. And this is a remarkable instrument which allows you to maximize the tax take, minimizing the economic trauma. But of course, it has a problem for the progressives, which is that on its face, it is regressive, because the less you have, the less you earn, the greater the relative part of your income that you must consume, And so the tax seems to be regressive, and it is regressive. But the regressive effect, according to this argument, is overborne, is overridden by the aggregate progressive effect of the level of social investment or social spending that this system makes possible. So again, let's not exaggerate the significance of this because, as I said, this is all ancillary to what is fundamental. What is fundamental are the arrangements that define the primary distribution of advantage. So this would be the second principle. Now, for this principle to be established in the public discourse, there has to be an explanation. So there's some pedagogic element. But judge for yourselves, this doesn't seem to be the object of any national conversation. Now then comes the third principle in the hierarchy. So the fact that compensatory and retrospective redistribution is subordinate to the innovations that shape the primary distribution of advantage, and that in this subordinate part, what matters most is the aggregate level of the tax take and how it's spent, doesn't mean that there's no appropriate role for progressive taxation. The whole system of the budget is ancillary to structural change, and in the system of the budget, progressive taxation is ancillary to the aggregate level of the tax take and how it's spent. But there's still a role for progressive taxation. Now, what in principle are the appropriate objects of progressive taxation? They are two. The first is the hierarchy of the standards of living. And the second is the accumulation of economic power. So these are two different aspects of economic inequality. So different levels of wealth and of income matter on one side because they shape this hierarchy of standards of living, and on the other side because they allow people to have power over other people. The use of capital as an instrument of power. The income tax is a confused fiscal instrument because it does not hit squarely either of these objects of progressive taxation. It is a hybrid instrument. And in principle, it would be better to have two distinct instruments to hit these two different targets. Now, it's much harder to hit the second target of the accumulation of economic power. The fundamental way of hitting that target is to change the organization of the economy, the innovation in the regime of property. And in taxation, it seems that the most effective way to address that target, although it's a secondary way, is the heavy taxation of inheritance, the hereditary transmission of capital, and anticipated inheritance by gifts inter vivos. And in the United States, that has been very difficult to sustain. Now, you know that it was only recently that there was a political struggle in the United States over the inheritance tax, and the two richest men in the country launched a national campaign to defend the taxation of inheritance. and they failed. And this is a subject of great interest. It shows the heavy ideological constraints on this. Now, what about the other target, the hierarchy of standards of living? There is a natural tax instrument for hitting the hierarchy of the standards of living. It is the individualized, the tax on consumption, the tax on individualized consumption, which was first theorized by one of Keynes's disciples, Nicholas Kaldor, and is therefore sometimes called the Kaldor tax. So the way it works is this. You take the aggregate income of the individual, of the taxpayer, including all returns to capital. You don't give returns to capital a more favored treatment than returns to labor. And you subtract from the aggregate income of the individual the demonstrated invested saving of the individual. That difference between aggregate income and invested saving is what the individual spends on himself, that is to say, on his standard of living, and determines the hierarchy of the standards of living. So you could then have a tax system organized in the following way. Beneath a certain level of income, the individual would pay nothing. In fact, he would receive. That's the equivalent to the negative income tax or minimum universal income. Above that level, he would begin to pay on a steep slope, steeply more progressive. And then at the very highest levels of luxury living, the individual would pay a multiple of 100% to the state. So notice that in the income tax, even conceptually, the highest possible marginal rate is 100%. But in the Kaldor tax, there is no top marginal rate. The sky's the limit. So you could say that beyond a certain level of luxury living, for each dollar that the individual spends on himself, he pays 4 to the state. So the top marginal rate is 400%. There's no limit, there's no technical difficulty. The technical difficulties in the administration of this tax are exactly the same as the technical difficulties of the administration of the personal income tax, with the advantage that in this tax, what is not demonstrated as invested saving counts as spent and is therefore taxed. So you might think that if the progressives were both lucid and sincere about their devotion to corrective redistribution, this is the tax that they would favor. And why don't they favor it? Because if you really wanted to achieve redistribution through corrective taxation, this is what you would do. You wouldn't be limited to 100%. You would be limited only by your political will and power. There'd be no technical impediment. So these three theses then define a view of the way to approach the financing of the state that is compatible with the progressive goals. Now, let me stop before going further and invite your comment. Yes?
Yeah, in working on the paper and thinking through some of the reforms and innovations, I might discuss, I realized
But the end with respect to what?
Like, what does a progressive world look like?
Well, there's no one answer to that question, right? Because, and in a way, that's why I began with the critique of the message of the American prophets. So the issue is, what is the unifying theme of these transformations? And my suggestion was that it's that we become bigger together. So it's the enhancement of agency, but not in the form of the creation of an elite, of heroes, of saints, of geniuses, of entrepreneurs, but in which the scope of the ordinary life of ordinary men and women becomes larger. Greater intensity, greater range, greater capability. So that's the suggestion, that we characterize it as deep freedom rather than as shallow equality. And, but that's only one suggestion. That's only, as it were, the beginning. Because in this discourse, there are many different aspects. So remember, I began with this idea that the characteristic posture of the contemporary progressives is to appear on the stage of history as the humanizers of the inevitable. So they take as given the project of their conservative adversaries and put a human face on it, largely through compensatory redistribution. And this is a losing position in politics, because the force that commands the agenda in political struggles is always the force that most credibly represents the cause of energy, of innovation, of construction, and not simply the humanization of the energy organized by your adversaries. So that's, to me, the beginning of the point. So it's not that we are putting a human face on the established organization, is that we're increasing the range of the experience and capabilities of the ordinary man and woman, a larger life. And we ascend to this larger life together. Seems to me to be a way to characterize the essential message. So if there is a more advanced part of the economy, now the knowledge economy, we attempt to establish it in its most inclusive possible form, so that we participate as producers as well as consumers in its construction and so forth. That I would take as the point of departure. Yes?
If we consider some sort of Calder tax where the top marginal rate would be like 400%.
Yes.
I was very intrigued by that, and I'm wondering how to concurrently predict and mitigate potential negative effects on the overall consumption, which could call for a slowdown. Like, if we are to...
But that's only at the top. That's a tiny range of rich people who have this luxury living. Now, furthermore, of course, understand, this is not a blueprint. Like tomorrow we're going to establish a 400% rate. It's simply to describe a direction. So it's a polemic in which I'm saying the progressives say they're interested in redistribution. If they're really interested in redistribution through taxation, why aren't they interested in this, which is the instrument that seems to give the largest space to redistribution through the tax system?
I just think the narrow-minded view, which I'm trying to overcome, would be to say, well, this will slow down consumption, even though it may just be for luxury goods. You know, just trying to think through kind of a practical counter-argument to that.
But the conventional economic thesis is that the richer you are, the less the part of your income that is committed to consumption. And the question is whether you want to tolerate ostentatious and luxury consumption in the society. If it exacts an economic cost, then you have to decide whether you're willing to pay or not that economic cost. But the main point is that there's no technical difficulty. That there's an instrument which is perfectly adequate to the goal, if that's what you really want. But it's not clear that that's what the progressives really want. Yes? You had your hand up here?
Oh, sorry, I was going to essentially
Sure.
say what you said.
Yes.
What defines luxury consumption?
What is, excuse me?
Sorry, what defines luxury consumption?
What is?
What defines luxury consumption?
Well, nothing defines it a priori, right? It's simply saying that there's a hierarchy of standards of living in society. And that hierarchy of the standards of living is one of the two main objects of progressive taxation. And so how much difference in the standards of living do you want to tolerate? That's different from the other phenomenon of accumulation of economic power. And in principle, it seems that that is one of the two possible targets of progressive taxation. And so how much of it do you want to tolerate? How different is the way of living of people in society? And if that's one of the main concerns, there's a way to address it. That's the simple argument. So what do they really want? They say they're mainly interested in this compensatory redistribution, but then the instrument that they proposed doesn't seem to be the instrument that is most adequate to the goal that they themselves elect as the priority goal, that is confusion. And it's the effort to dispel this confusion. Yes?
Yeah, so to me it seems like Robert Frank is one of the few mainstream economists that actually support this idea. So why, and I think that is connected to why social democrats, for example, doesn't really go with this idea. So do you have any suggestion for why that might be? That few conventional economists seem to propose or support?
Well, actually, among tax lawyers and fiscal experts who study taxation, the individualized tax on consumption has a great following. So take Harvard Law School. This is above suspicion. No one would say it's a hotbed of revolutionary ideas, but a long sequence of tax experts, professors of taxation here, have defended it to no effect. So they write articles in the Law Reviews, and it's like they were throwing it down a well. So it's not as if this doesn't have technical support. It does. So it seems to me that it's mysterious, it's elusive why this is not caught on. But it seems to have something to do with the following problem that is a persistent theme in these discussions. To promote something like this, like the Caldor tax, you have to be willing to really shake things up. And if you were really willing to shake things up, and if you had the political instruments as well as the motives for this subversive activity, it seems unlikely that your subversive efforts would be limited to this narrow goal. So then you would become interested in all the other theses, and not just in this last one. But that then is a much more fundamental change. So it seems that that's what's standing behind this mystery. That really what explains the appearance of intellectual confusion is the fundamental attitude of surrender to the established world. And that all you can do is humanize. Once you begin to think that it can be torn apart piece by piece, then all these things become thinkable. Yes?
I've sort of been toying with this idea in my brain, very similar to what you were just saying about like taking the risk and taking that step forward, and sort of a combination of your thesis 1 and thesis 2. I guess, and that's all precursor to my forming thought, which is sort of about how like the hypocrisy of the progressives, in that in your book Knowledge Economy, you were talking about how they're expected to go through the stages of indispensable itinerary, like going through the stages of the Industrial Revolution in each of the developing countries. And this has sort of made me think about how, for example, like economically lowering the price of crude oil so that developing countries have the ability to have their Industrial Revolution, and then poo-pooing them for it. I'm just curious, like, how this ties in to people willing or not willing to take that big step, if that makes sense.
What's the this? How this ties in?
How the idea of like people sort of saying like, oh, well, we have to take care about the environment, but we're taking, lowering crude oil prices, and then saying, well, don't do the Industrial Revolution. It's this like hypocrisy of sort of like the pulling sides. Does that make sense? I feel like I'm sort of tying a lot of ideas
It doesn't
together.
seem like a problem of hypocrisy. That is, I don't take this as a moral denunciation. It's a set of confusions in which and in the background of it is this idea which we discussed right at the beginning of the course, that on the Marxist view, on the view that has inspired much of traditional leftism and progressivism, fundamental transformation would be systemic transformation, meaning the substitution of capitalism by socialism, even though those categories have become increasingly empty of meaning. And so this systemic transformation seems inaccessible or too dangerous. And what's left to do? What's left to do is to humanize the existing world. So, and everything else then seems like a leap into the dark. So that fundamental set of assumptions and attitudes is what's involved. It doesn't seem that we can accurately describe that problem as a problem of hypocrisy. That's a problem of a combination of confusion and surrender, of resignation to the historical circumstance, from which the contemporary societies have been liberated only by trauma in the form of either economic collapse or war. Yes?
I've advocated as a climate organizer for a progressive carbon tax in
Yeah.
Japan, and encountered some of this confusion that I'm trying to unpack, where in advocating for a market-based mechanism that is fundamentally redistributive, it's the market that triggers some progressives in saying, well, you're like a capitalist sellout, and I didn't pay attention to the distribution of that wealth and like having a high enough tax that it ends the fossil fuel industry. And it seems like a lot of the confusion comes down to different definitions of capitalism. big amorphous idea, and you're either for
No.
that or you're not?
Well, so the concept of capitalism is an example of the problem. So I don't believe in the concept of capitalism. It should be obvious in these arguments. So, concept of capitalism makes sense in the context of a theoretical system like that of Karl Marx, in which there are regimes, indivisible systems. One of them is capitalism, and they either change altogether or they don't change. The binary view of politics. And there are laws. There are laws of capitalism. There are laws governing the transformation of systems. But there's no such thing. There's the market order as it developed in modern history in the North Atlantic world is a contingent set of arrangements. All of the parts of it do reinforce one another. They have far-reaching influence and they're recalcitrant to change, but they're not a system. So you could call it structure, not system. And structural change, when it occurs, is fragmentary change. Every particular structural change is ambiguous because it can serve as an excuse to not go further, or it can be a step toward the next step. And so the meaning is always determined by what comes next. So that's the nature of historical change. And so what happens in the world is that, on the whole, the leftists, the progressives, have ceased to believe in the social theoretical assumptions of systems like Marxism, but they continue to use the vocabulary. So they don't believe, if you challenge them, they would say, they don't believe that there's this closed menu of systems, that each of them is indivisible, that there are these laws governing their foreordained succession. But the vocabulary that they use is the vocabulary of that theoretical system in which they no longer believe. So this then becomes a form of self-deception and confusion. And this is one of my main concerns in these arguments of ours. So I want to just emphasize to all of you a deliberate choice that I described earlier in the course. Any direction of change can be explored at points relatively close to what exists and relatively far away from what exists. So in these programmatic discussions, I am generally choosing to emphasize the points that are neither very close nor very far away, the intermediate level. Because the intermediate level is the one that lends itself most to conceptual clarification. But it has a practical disadvantage. The practical disadvantage is that the alternatives described at this intermediate level are too far away from what exists to seem readily feasible, but not far away enough to arouse enthusiasm. And that's why in the discourse of practical politics, we, on the whole, disregard this intermediate level and emphasize the very proximate and the very distant. So the discourse of transformation is at once practical and prophetic. But not here. Because here we're not in politics. And we should have the advantages of our disadvantages. So what's our advantage? Our advantage is the luxury of conceptual clarification. We're not trying to persuade anyone. We're just trying to persuade ourselves. If we could persuade ourselves, we could persuade the whole world. And So it's a different choice, but you have to understand in your minds that the same ideas that are here being described in this rather cold form of the intermediate level can be explored in the hot form of what's very close or what's very far away. And you have to correct for this deliberate choice that I'm making in the rhetorical strategy of emphasizing these intermediate points. So it doesn't make any sense to act here in this room as if we were in a political struggle, because we don't have the advantages of a political struggle. So let's have the advantages of not being in a political struggle, which is that we can think things through. And that's the choice that I'm making. And like every choice, it has a cost. So you equalize the cost in your response. So all of this, so this is as it were, the first axis of a progressive alternative in the American context, the political economy of the progressives, with these four elements. The relation of the backward to the advanced parts of the economy, the relation of labor to capital, the relation of finance to production, and the rethinking of the financing of the state. So let's say that's the first axis. Now, the second axis is then the formation of the capable agent, the individual, especially through education. And what then is the central problem of education in a democracy? The family says to the child, become like me. And the state says to the child, serve me. But under democracy, we want the school to be the servant neither of the family nor of the state. And we want the individual agent to be formed not just to be capable within the present context, but to be able to resist the context, to see beyond it, and to act against it. So the ideal of education under democracy is to recognize in every child, in every young person, a tongue-tied prophet. And the school then is to be the voice of the future. That's the ideal. Now, how is this ideal to be implemented in practical circumstances, such as the circumstances of American democracy today? So there are two parts. One part is the pedagogic paradigm, the method of teaching and learning. And the other part is the institutional setting in a country that is big, unequal, and federal in structure, like the United States. How to reconcile the local management of the schools by the states and towns with national standards of investment and quality. Now, let me begin with the first, with the pedagogic paradigm, the method of teaching and learning. So, the major educational reformer in the United States was John Dewey. He was the ideologist of the top tier of the American educational system. So in the United States, there is a dualistic educational system. There are two educational systems. There's an elite formed by the leading private schools and by the top tier of public schools. And this elite top is under the aegis of a truncated form of Dewey's program. And then there's the rest, in which is a program for occupying time, instilling discipline, and teaching in the 19th century manner of the encyclopedia. Now, first, with Dewey's program, what happened? Dewey's program had two parts. One part was the priority accorded to the mastery of analytic capabilities or conceptual skills over the mastery of dead information, memorization, achieved especially through teamwork and dialogue. And the second part of Dewey's program was criticism, the development of critical capabilities. What has, on the whole, happened in the system of American elite education is that the first part of Dewey's program was accepted and the second part was rejected. And what replaced it? What replaced it seems to be, above all, the mastery of a certain style of sociability, which is required as useful or even indispensable to participation in the American professional business class. So, for example, it's a style of sociability characterized by what you might describe as a cheerful impersonal friendliness, which the individual is encouraged to develop a form of seductive charisma, which he then conceals in a self-depreciating way, casting a spell on his fellows, but at the same time denying it, so that he seems a pliant instrument of teamwork. So it's a very particular style of sociability. And the mastery of this style of sociability and the preparation of the individual for a form of social life, of relations with other people, which Madame de Staël described as denying us solitude without affording us company, is the real object of this style of education. It's what replaces the critical element in Dewey's program. So that's not what we want, what the progressives should want. They should want a different style of education. And what then are the attributes of this style of education? My proposal is that it has 4 attributes. The first is that it prefers analytic and synthetic capabilities, the capabilities of the imagination, to the mastery of data, of information. Now, these capabilities cannot be acquired in a vacuum of content. We acquire these capabilities in dealing with content, but what matters with respect to content is not encyclopedic coverage, but selective depth. So therefore, we have a form of education that is thematic or project-oriented. And that then is the second characteristic. The third characteristic is that the social setting of education is cooperative, as advanced science is. So collaboration among students, among teachers, among schools, rather than the juxtaposition of individualism and authoritarianism, which characterizes the traditional classroom. And the fourth characteristic is that it is dialectical. So no subject can be taught just once. Every subject must be taught at least twice from opposing points of view. And if we prefer selective deepening to encyclopedic superficiality, there is then time for this dialectical approach. So we return to the point about the orthodoxies of the university culture. The university culture is established on the basis of a series of forced marriages between subject and method. So economics is not the study of the economy. It's the study of a method pioneered by the marginalist theoreticians in the end of the 19th century. The life sciences are taught by a historical method. Fundamental physics is taught by an anti-historical method, even though we discovered in the 1920s that the universe has a history. Just because the main paradigms of fundamental physics today, quantum mechanics and relativity, emerged just before the discovery of the historical character of the universe. So then the national curriculums in the world project these orthodoxies of the university culture back to the education of the young. That's what they are. They're infantilizations of these orthodoxies, and they attempt to induce the young to mistake the dominant ideas for the way things are. So what do we want? We want basic education to be more profound than university education, and to immunize the young against the acceptance of these orthodoxies, so that they are delivered to the higher stages of education, resistant rather than emasculated, as they now are. And so this is the educational form of the idea of the enhancement of agency, liberation. And it's a more ambitious idea of education, which should be the object of the progressives, and a radicalization of the Deweyan program beyond the limits of Dewey's own message, and certainly beyond the limits of its implementation in the United States. Well, that's with regard to the content. And it's not a content which applies just to general education. It applies also to technical education. The dominant model of technical education in the world is the old German model of job-specific and machine-specific vocational training. By contrast to the higher order flexible capabilities that are required for the use of numerically controlled machine tools. It's a different story. You don't learn to deal with 3D printers and additive manufacturing the way you learn to deal with the metal cutting lathes of mass production industry. And so then you have a continuum between this new style of general education and what technical education should be. You don't have a radical contrast between general education for the elites and technical training for the masses. The spirit of technical education and general education is the same. And of course, a program like this cannot be instituted by a small circle of educational despots, enlightened despots. It has to be a national pedagogic vanguard. Hundreds, thousands of schools, of teachers who are collectively engaged in this movement, which is a movement of national liberation. It's a great national project. And so then you could say, well, the other side is then the institutional setting, within which such an alternative becomes feasible. And the goal is to reconcile the local management of the schools by the states and towns with national standards of investment and quality, in order to ensure the simple principle that the quality of the education that a young person receives should not depend on the happenstance of where or to whom it is born. A central principle of democracy. And now you need three tools, three instruments to assure this reconciliation of local management with national standards. The first instrument is you need to know what works. And therefore you need to see what happens in each school and to each child all over the country. And so that you can then disseminate what works rather than being in the hands of a dogma. The second is that you need to have a redistributive mechanism within the federation to redistribute resources and even staff from richer places to poorer places. So that second instrument is, of course, incompatible with the complete dependence of the school system on local finance, which continues to prevail in the United States. The third principle is that there has to be some corrective mechanism to deal with a local failing school system that persistently falls beneath the minimum acceptable threshold of quality. So if despite all efforts and despite all support, the local system remains beneath the level of quality, there has to be some way of intervening in it, taking it over, and fixing it. And now it can't be by some intervention, some unilateral intervention of the federal government. There'd have to be a trans-federal system in which the different levels of the federation would be jointly represented, joint bodies, that would come to the rescue of these local failing school systems, take them over temporarily, assign their administration to independent administrators, fix them and return them fixed. As you might do with a failing company in a Chapter 11 bankruptcy. By cooperative federalism, vertical and horizontal cooperation within the federation. And the system of cooperative federalism harnessed then to this change in the pedagogic project, in the method of teaching and learning. Well, that's just the outline of a program. And it seems to me that a program of this kind should be equal in importance to the political economy, because it is creating the conditions for the individuals to stand up. And you create a nation of resistors who can stand on their own feet. Yes?
I mean, so I took a class in politics and policy and education last semester, and I left that class feeling like that is how I feel, but with the consensus in that room, it was very much like education was built from the bottom up. We started with these tiny localized communities that grew into the federal education system versus like medicine, for example, which was sort of a top-down approach. And I guess like I personally just struggle with this, like that's my dream, but it's already been tried to happen. Like the government takes over schools and they fail miserably and nothing gets better. And so I think like, yes, that's the dream, but in reality, like those things that we're talking about doing, we've done them and they didn't work. And so like that's where I'm struggling with like education being the place to make structural change with those children, and yet when we make that structural change, it doesn't
Yeah.
actually fundamentally happen without economic restructuring.
There has to be a movement, right? And it has to be, it can't just be local tinkering that's not part of this national movement. So it has to have resonance. It's not just, as it were, a technical problem, a fix-it. It is, as I say, a movement of national liberation. So there's many countries in the world that have had educational reformers who are regarded as founders or refounders of their countries. But John Dewey, yes, but John Dewey doesn't really have that status in the United States,
He does in
right?
the education world, though.
In the education world, but not for the country as a whole. And and of course, there's a very intimate relation between an educational program like this one and the project of an inclusive knowledge economy. So, as there is a relation to the political program. So, of course, when we're dealing with education, we're dealing with the whole spirit of the country. And we're transcending the limits of party politics. So it's a spiritual movement as well as a political economic movement. It extends the level of ambition. And you have to imagine that what would occur in the sphere of politics, of party politics, would then be reinforced by this prophetic action in other departments of national culture. But I think that there's nothing in the United States, in American society or in American culture, which is necessarily against such a logic. I think the political form of it would always be controversial. But the general direction, I would like to think, is something that is very hospitable to the American spirit. But you tell me what you think. Yes?
Oh, I was thinking about the first principle that you mentioned, to prefer sensitive capabilities versus the domination or mastery of data.
The encyclopedia, yes.
And I think more from the South, from Latin America, sometimes in public universities, you don't even receive like a good quality education for technical
Yes.
capabilities that will prepare you to get into the market.
Yes.
And sometimes this is like the most urgent things we need in our educational system. So can you afford to think about sensitivity and more critical thinking when sometimes you lack these basic capacities that will allow you to
Yes.
have a place in the economy, particularly relating it to what you mentioned, to your whole picture of the knowledge economy and
Yes.
this huge gap between countries that have small, how do you call them, islands, like archipelagos of knowledge versus
Yes.
economies, in this case Mexico, that are like a manufacturing element of a bigger economy, which is
Yes.
the US. So can we really afford these kind of projects?
Well, I don't understand the relation between what you said before and this last comment. It seemed that you were moving in the direction of saying that what we need is to make people capable. So how could we not afford that? That is, traditional education is neither theoretical nor practical. It doesn't make people capable. And this is at every level. So take legal education. Here we are in a law school. So the fundamental characteristic of legal education all over the world is that it is neither theoretical nor practical. It's a form of doctrinal scholasticism. The students feel that they have to go to work in law firms in order to learn to do something. They don't even learn the rules in law school. For that, they take a course at the end of the 3 years of law study and memorize the rules. So what they study at the law school is a rhetorical apparatus, how to argue. And this is a pervasive experience of education. You're rendered incapable, and then you're a victim. You have to follow the escalator, the tendency. So in principle, there should be no contradiction between intellectual ambition and practical capability. They should be married. They should be conjoined. And this is the idea. But my hope is that an educational program in any of the large countries of the world today is capable of arousing enthusiasm, because it's a promise of the ascent of the individual to a higher state. Now, people often say that it only has an effect in the long term. So you invest in an educational transformation and it produces effects 30 years from now. But that's not true. Because when there's an educational transformation, there's an immediate effect. Because you plant in the society a seed of restlessness, of emulation, of ambition, in which the individual sees another possibility for himself right at the beginning. And that has an immediate effect. Now, if there's not a parallel movement in political economy, then the individual will feel circumscribed. So in that sense, these things are all connected. But there's a vast advantage in creating this restlessness in the society through the educational program right away. Yes?
But just building on this question, I think what you guys articulated is ideal for the capable citizen for participating in politics and society, but still hasn't fully articulated the ideal relationship for progressives between education and economy. And to give
Yes.
specifics, you could articulate different systems in which the federal, state, or federally backed education systems abdicate their explicit role in trying to prepare individuals for the marketplace and instead say that's the role of corporations. I mean, as was the case in, I think, the career man in a lot of U.S. history, versus, and as I'm hearing in Mexico, which is, look, public education is not even preparing people for a basic level of jobs. What is the role of the progressive version of education to make sure that they can meet their minimum lifestyle requirements or livelihood requirements? Do you see, where do you think the progressive stance on that is?
Well, so previously, the most advanced form of production was mass production, industrial mass production. And the theoreticians of industrial mass production paid lip service to education. But as I've said before, the reality is that under mass production, very little was required by way of education. For a worker in a mass production factory, you really only need 3 things. You need rudimentary literacy and numeracy, the ability to understand instructions, basic physical dexterity, especially hand-eye coordination, and a disposition to obedience. So this lower tier of the educational system in the United States could be understood as education for that world. That world no longer exists. It's declining. So the knowledge economy, unlike industrial mass production, does require an advanced form of education. And this form of education that I described. So if the knowledge economy is just an island, a series of fringes, then most people won't be required to have those capabilities. But if we imagine it as having evolving in a dynamic of inclusion, of dissemination, then one of its several requirements will be a cognitive or educational requirement.
That makes sense. But then to reframe the question, what does a transitional education program look like that addresses worker needs in the period in between preparing them for the new knowledge economy?
The two things have to go together. That is, you have to form this agent, and you have to change the economic order simultaneously, because the economic order capable of demanding these skills, as you're implying, doesn't yet exist. So we have to have the two ideas at the same time. If a large part of the population is formed on this more ambitious model of education, then it becomes also a constituency for this transformation of the economic order. And the things go together. We would never bring about such a profound change in the character of education for simply narrow economic reasons. It has an economic justification, but it would only ever really happen if we had this broader ambition for people, for politics, for society, which is at its heart an ambition of shared bigness. This idea of becoming greater together, which is this. The aim is not the humanization of society, the divinization of humanity. It's the fundamental spiritual idea that we become more human by becoming more godlike. This is what lies at the heart of such an educational program and inspires all of the aspects of such a project. So, and this does communicate with the message of the American prophets, corrected. So this message of the ability of the individual to increase his share in the divine attribute of transcendence, not by isolated self-help, but in some form of collective action. And so a program like this looks beyond the limits of politics. And it is always, like every profound transformation in society, at once political and religious. This is what every profound transformation is like. And we change the spirit, but then we insist on changing the institutions, because not to change the institutions would be a form of world abandonment. Yes?
You mentioned earlier that under a progressive education model,
Yes.
that the form of education would be thematic. And this may be going too far into the weeds, but would you envision an educational system under the progressive model that does away with the traditional grade levels or age categories? And I say this because in our traditional system, we expect students to learn at the same pace, and that just seems unrealistic and also incompatible with this idea of providing students with a more profound education.
I think this is very complicated, and I don't myself feel competent to speak to that, because there's an obvious tension. On the one hand, we want people to progress at their own rate and to have some element of individualization, but we don't want to segregate a category of geniuses, and we want them to be present in the whole. So it's this problem that has to be managed, right? Of how we are to do this. And let me pause for a moment on that concept of genius that I mentioned, because it's one way of characterizing the larger aim of such an educational ambition. So, Schopenhauer remarks in his great work, The World as Well and The world is will and representation. A contrast between a talented person and a genius. He says, a talented man is a marksman who hits a target that others cannot hit. A genius is a marksman who hits a target that others cannot see. So we think of genius as a kind of super intelligence, as a kind of facility, but that's not what it is. Genius is vision. And this is the quality that we want to cultivate generally in humanity, this quality of vision, which is not facility. And it is a way of characterizing the largest aim of such an educational program. And we want this quality of vision, this prophetic quality, this visionary impulse, to be widely diffused in the whole of humanity. This is another definition of the democratic idea. It's not just like the Protestant Reformation, the priesthood of all believers. It's the dissemination of these prophetic powers in the whole of humanity. And that's what we want in education. And this experience of vision to be widely available. And not for there to be this subset, this elite, which then is visionary and is separated from the rest. They develop their vision by inspiring their peers. So that's the problem with which we have to experiment. And I imagine that there's no formula for this. But what we want is this reciprocal arousal, this contamination in this kind of education, of excitement, and depth promotes excitement, as opposed to encyclopedic superficiality. Now, yes?
So, I mean, what really seems to me problematic, though, is how to, this ambition that we're talking about, it just doesn't seem to be there, right? And it seems to not just not show itself, but also to be constantly blocked by this need for disposition to be obedient. I think that which we're learning in the current educational system right now also goes beyond
Yes.
our economic rule.
Yes.
I think it speaks kind of to a reluctance towards change, which seems to me is really the bigger obstacle.
Yes.
we need to overcome.
It is, because there's at the root of this is an idea of agency, of resistance, of troublemaking, and in which there's no simple antithesis between cooperation and troublemaking. So it's a higher ideal. And there's a tension, there's an obvious tension, but the experience of agency is self-reinforcing. So once you stand up, once you resist, once you rebel, once you discover, it's an intoxication. And no one who has that could go back to the other thing. So the question is, to what extent and by what means can this experience be made a shared experience? And this is why this touches on this very profound religious and philosophical theme of whether we become greater alone or whether we become greater together, which has to do with every aspect of this project. Now, before the class is over, let me just briefly outline then the third large axis of such a progressive project, and that's the deepening of democracy. So the political economy of the democratizing of the economic order, the formation of the capable individual, especially through education, and then the deepening of democracy. So what then is the democracy that we want? We want a democracy that can master the social structure overthrow the rule of the living by the dead, and diminish the dependence of change on crisis. And we can imagine 3 sets of institutional innovations addressed to this aim. So the first set of institutional innovations is designed to raise the temperature of politics. By that I mean the level of organized popular engagement in political life. So this idea stands in opposition to what I described in an earlier class as one of the basic premises of conservative political science and statecraft. That we have to choose at the end of the day between a cold institutional politics and a hot anti-institutional politics. We have to choose between Madison and Mussolini. By opposition, we think that political arrangements can differ in the extent to which they elevate this level of organized popular engagement in political life. So we have a form of political life that is both institutional and hot. Because only a hot politics, hot in this sense, is a politics that is rich in structural content. So what does that mean? That has to do with the arrangements defining the relation between money and politics, first. So the public financing of political activity and the constraints on private financing. Second, it has to do with the access to the means of mass communication. So for example, that there would be free access to the political parties and organized social movements to the means of mass communication as a condition for the media businesses holding their revocable licenses. And third, the electoral regimes. The effect of electoral regimes is always circumstantial. So in some contexts, a system of proportional representation is mobilizing, and in another context, a system of first past the post is mobilizing. It all depends on the context. Now, the second set of innovations has to do with the pace of politics. So we want to accelerate the pace rather than to perpetuate impasse. So in the American constitutional arrangements, there are 2 principles. There is the liberal principle of the fragmentation of power, the doctrine of separation of powers, and there's the conservative principle of the slowing down of politics, Madison's scheme of checks and balances. And there's the idea that these 2 principles are naturally and necessarily conjoined, but they're not. They're conjoined by design and intention, and not by necessity. So it would be possible to affirm the liberal principle, but to repudiate the conservative one. For example, if there's an impasse between the political branches, either of the 2 branches could unilaterally enjoy the constitutional prerogative to call anticipated elections, to break the impasse. But the elections would always be bilateral for both political branches. So the branch that exercised the constitutional prerogative of calling the early elections would always have to pay the political price of running the electoral risk. And that would be an inhibition on the excessive use of the constitutional prerogative. So it's a simple thought experiment to show how, by a very simple device, you can invert the logic of the Madisonian scheme and turn the presidential system into a machine for the acceleration of politics rather than for its slowing down, which is what it was designed to do. Now then, the third principle is to tap the experimentalist potential of the federal regime. So, the premise of conservative statecraft and political science is that there's a hydraulic inverse relation between power to the center, to the federal government, and power to local government. The more power one has, the less power the other has. But it is possible to have strong central initiative and radical devolution to local government at the same time. So you can imagine two stages in the energizing of the federal system. The first stage is you amplify the opportunity for cooperative federalism, both vertically and horizontally in the federation. Vertically, cooperation among the three levels of the federation, and horizontally, cooperation among states and among municipalities. And cooperative federalism is an instrument of experimentation. And then there'd be a second stage, further in the future, in which you can imagine that a particular state could apply for a right of very wide divergence from the national solution, so long as the divergence is not used abusively to exclude some group or to entrench the prerogatives of a group. So it would have to be vetted politically and vetted judicially at the same time. If the right of divergence is uniform in the federation, in other words, if all the states enjoy simultaneously the same right of divergence, the divergence can't be very wide. You have to say that a particular state, under certain conditions, could apply for a right of very wide divergence. And what's the idea? The idea is as the country goes down a certain road, it hedges its bets and allows a part of itself to secede from the dominant solutions and to create a counter-model of the national future. And so you have a dialectic in the country of alternative paths. Now, in general, you know that in these three sets of innovations, the innovations regarding the temperature of politics, especially the relations between money and politics, the innovations regarding the pace of politics, the constitutional setup of a government, and the innovations regarding federalism, the American progressives on the whole seem to have opted to prioritize the first set of innovations. It seems to me that the obvious place to begin is the third set of innovations, federalism, because they have the very widest appeal in the United States, and they cut across the divisions between left and right. And so the natural sequence is first federalism, then the temperature of politics, and then last, only last, the constitutional arrangements, because in the United States they're sacrosanct as part of the constitutional document. And this would be, as it were, the natural sequence in the United States in the direction of the creation of a high-energy democracy. So the energizing or the re-energizing of the federal system would be the most natural place to begin in the American context. And it has a direct relation to the other themes. So The educational alternative requires experimentation within the federal system. The development of an inclusive form of the knowledge economy can take place, if it takes place at all, only at the state level. And there's a natural point of departure. The governors have the simple, primitive idea of their own Silicon Valley, then that doesn't work. Then they look for an alternative form of industrial policy, and that's where you begin. So there's a bridge between the re-energizing of federalism and the reinvention of industrial policy. So what do you think? Do you agree with that proposition? That in this sequence, the third step is the natural place to begin? The re-energizing of federalism. Yes?
Can you just describe how different your vision is from what currently exists?
With respect to what?
Federalism, like in terms of the states, for instance, diverging in.
So first of all, you know that in the classic doctrine of federalism, already described even in the Federalist Papers at the time of the foundation of the Republic, the states are supposed to be laboratories of experimentation. In reality, under classical federalism, there's a straitjacket. There's a rigid allocation of competences among the three levels of the federal system. And there are very narrow opportunities for collaboration, either vertical or horizontal. So the first step is you have to open up the opportunities for cooperative federalism, in which states can do things together, and the three levels of the federal system can work together in the development of the economic and educational alternatives. That's one huge advance, and already beyond what exists. But there seems to be a very broad constituency in the United States for that kind of movement. And my impression is that many of the governors of both parties would support it. They have their regional organizations, and they're clamoring for more opportunities of cooperative federalism. The content would have to come from these economic and educational initiatives. Now, then there's the second step, which is much more radical. The second step is to say, if you really want there to be an opportunity for what I'm calling wide divergence in a federal system, you cannot impose the constraint of uniform divergence. Because if all the states in the Union have to enjoy simultaneously the same power of divergence, the divergence can't be very radical. So for there to be wide divergence, a state has to be able to apply for a right to secede from part of the general legal order. Now, of course, we couldn't tolerate that if the secession were used for the purpose of entrenching some form of oppression or exclusion. And so it has to be controlled politically and judicially. And there would have to be a jurisprudence of standards, as there is for due process or equal protection, developed by the jurists, by the courts, to shape this right of wide divergence. But we have a natural experiment. Take China with one country, two systems. So it wasn't designed that there would be Hong Kong, two systems. But imagine this as a project in which the society says, we want to be able to experiment about our national future. So we go down a certain road that the national government takes, but we'll hedge our bets. And we'll allow a part of our country to take a different path. So we'll see what it looks like. And this is a response to a fundamental aim of the progressives that I've repeatedly described, which is we need to affirm the primacy of structural alternatives. But we don't want to succumb to a structural dogmatism. We don't want to entrust our future to a definitive blueprint. So how do we find alternatives? We need a machinery for the creation of alternatives in which we can experiment with them and see what they look like. And a federal system is good for that. So it's then this idea that we're raising the level of experimental energy in the economy, in education, and now in democratic politics. And we're then creating the basis for the repeated formulation of these alternatives that will try out experimentally rather than succumb to dogmatically. So the theme next week is European social democracy, more briefly than the United States. And at that point, after next week, 1/3 of the course will be over, right? This is the fourth class. Is this the fourth class or the third class? This is the fourth, so 1/3 is over today already. And so just so you know, we have 12 classes. Next week will be the fifth.